It is the 11 Dubcast. I'm Johnny. He's George. We're getting ever closer to the beginning of Ohio State's football season, the beginning of the college football season, actually.
Sweet.
I think, next weekend is the first games, I believe, as
the
that
weekend
starts?
after the next, yes.
Okay. So we've got, I thought there was one going on the 24th.
I thought you meant Ohio State.
No,
games.
Ohio State starts the 31st.
Yeah,
so
there's always the week 0.
That's right. So we got week 0 matchups, and then Ohio State starts Labor Day weekend, which I'm well aware of because I'm weekend editor that weekend. That's going to be fun.
And I'm weekend editor this weekend.
Oh, hooray.
Yeah.
So lots of stuff going on, and we thought at the 11 Dubcast headquarters here and splitting between South Carolina and Columbus, Ohio, that we should talk a little bit about the upcoming season as opposed to just rehashing stories about Michigan sign stealing and all that stuff. So I've got a lot of questions that I want answered. All right. I got a lot of things that I want to know, and hopefully we can get this hashed out between the two of us, George. So there's a lot of things that I think people have, relative certainty about with this Ohio State season. And
Real quick. If you are hankering for college football, week 0 does start this Saturday, and the game in Ireland is number 10 Florida State at Georgia Tech. And Florida State is
two most Irish teams I can think of.
Right. Well, Florida State is only an 11-point favorite, if you can believe that. So that game could be a little bit more competitive than people are anticipating. Otherwise, you could just settle for Montana State at New Mexico. That's the second most closely lined week 0 game. So
also a banger.
Take your pick.
There you go.
If you're like, I gotta have college football.
Yeah, I don't know how many people in Ireland are hankering to see like the Florida State Seminoles play football.
Presumably more than we're hankering to see Northwestern Nebraska.
Well, yes. I mean, I guess that would have to be the case. I don't know how it couldn't, not be the case, but regardless, it's coming up. It's upon us. So we want to talk a little bit about some of the things related to Ohio State that we've been thinking about, some of the questions that we have for the season, and we want to try to hash some of this stuff out here in this week's 11 Dubcast and talk a little bit. It's going to serve a little bit as a season preview. In the past, we've gone like game by game and stuff like that, but in the truth, there's a lot of games and there's a lot of variables and there's a lot that might happen between now and whenever they play Michigan or whenever they play Penn State. Like there's a lot that has to happen. So
we're going to want to talk about Akron for 60 minutes next week. So
right.
We might as well get the season preview in now.
That's right. So we've got some questions. And we came up with 3 each. So what we'll do is we'll just trade off and just some of the burning questions that we have for this season and maybe the types of questions that we think are going to really influence how we view the season, especially the first part of it. So let's start with you, George. What do you got, sir?
All right. Well, let's start things off pretty easy before we get into the weeds, the dirty deets of this upcoming Buckeye football team. So let's keep it simple for starters. What position group, Mr. Johnny Ginter, do you have most confidence in, and which do you have the least confidence in?
Okay, well, I know that we discussed this a little bit. I know that our answer for the latter part of that question is the same. I am still really, really confident in how the defensive secondary is going to play. I don't see any holes there. Granted, they're returning pretty much everybody, right? And you know what you're going to get top to bottom, preseason All-Americans, all this kind of stuff. But I just think that what's going to make this team great, if they end up becoming great, like when I say great, I mean a team that wins the Big Ten championship, goes on to compete for national title, it's going to be the fact that nobody can throw on them. And whatever depth issues they might have along the defensive line, whatever kind of unproven, in terms of starting experience that they have at linebackers, that's not going to be much of a worry because you're going to have a secondary that nobody can throw more than like 4 or 5 yards on. So I am just really, really excited to see how that all shakes out, particularly with the addition of Downs, because that's an X factor to an already great defense that I think, I can envision him snatching 5 or 6 interceptions this season. He's going to be that kind of dude. I don't know, man. I mean, he's going to be all over the place. He fits in perfectly with it Jim Knowles wants to do on defense. He is that rangy rover kind of guy that Knowles loves to send all over the field and just says, go get the ball. And I think in this defense, he's just gonna totally wreck dudes. So I'm very, very excited. And I think the secondary is 100% my answer for that.
Yeah, Knowles has certainly been very praiseworthy of Downs already. So I'm sure many people are looking forward to seeing how he fits in. And obviously Burke is arguably the best player on the defense in general, and what's a unit carrying a lot of high expectations. So I think that's a more than fair answer. Is going to be fairly straightforward, but I mean, what Brian Hartline has built at the Ohio State offense in the receiving core is just a perennial powerhouse at this point. It's interesting, like going into this year, because as opposed to the last two seasons, I think, where you've always been able to say there's like two alphas, if you will, at the front of the pack that you can definitively point to, and then usually a third supporting member that is arguably just as good, if not poised to be just as good. There's one guy that is definitively at the front of the line this year, and then there's a few different potential supporting cast members that are very well poised to step up into that second alpha role, but it hasn't really quite been filled yet. So it's interesting compared to how the last 2 years have been, but based on what we have seen year in and year out from this group, there's no reason to not believe that one of those names underneath Emeka Egbuka is not going to live up to expectations. And it's going to be even further interesting for a guy like Egbuka, who's been able to thrive as the 1B behind a 1A for basically his entire career at Ohio State, regardless of who else has been running with him, is now going to be at the front of the line, presumably, for targets and receptions for the Ohio State passing attack. So regardless of what happens with Jeremiah Smith, I'm going to be very curious I'm less curious about Jeremiah Smith, honestly, just because so much praise and hype has already been anointed to him from not just Ryan Day and the coaching staff and the fans, but I like pretty much everybody involved, even people on our own beat group have been, overwhelmingly praiseworthy of him in practice. So I've tried to temper my own expectations for the guy just because he hasn't played a snap of college football yet. I'm more curious about, relative to the other receivers that have been able to thrive in this offense in the past as tertiary options. How is Carnell Tate going to perform? How is Brandon Ennis going to perform? Are they going to have to call on Jaden Ballard at some point if one of the guys in front gets hurt, or Mylan Graham as a true freshman? What are those supporting cast members going to be able to provide? But I have so much confidence based on what the previous ability and performance has been in recent seasons that I'm not worried about it, even though there are questions. I'm just looking forward to seeing how those questions get answered, regardless of what the answer ends up being. And that's a very comfortable position to be in as a fan that I don't think most fans of other teams necessarily have the luxury of getting. So it's, count your blessings while you have them, Buckeye fans, because the receiving core is definitely one that is usually just a write-off, and I think it is again this year too.
Yeah, they're just so deep. I mean, that's the thing. Like, okay, let's say a couple of those 5 stars don't pan out. Well, you've got 2 more, right? Like they can bring to bear so much talent at that position, from pretty much every spot, right? Like the X guys going out wide. Like there's so much that you can do there. And it's interesting because probably the most versatile guy that you have is the dude at the top, right? A guy who can play multiple positions at the wide receiver position. So yeah, I think that's a great answer. Honestly, I think that's, I think right up there with any other position in college football in terms of depth and overall talent. It's pretty wild what they've accumulated. The answer to least confident in, I think we probably share, I would imagine. I say offensive line. I'm pretty sure you say offensive line.
And I concur.
Okay, so then...
Especially after the events of the recent weekend involving Mr. Justin Fry.
All right, so let's talk about that. How does that connect then to your overall impression of the offensive line?
Well, it's just a further reflection of how like the group underneath Fry has been a bit of a letdown. I think that one of the it was shocking when Greg I always pronounce his name wrong. Sadrawa.
Yeah.
It was in the same way that it was a luxury for us to write off, Heartline bringing in these 5-star guys and then turning them into first-round NFL draft picks. It was incredibly impressive how I've already forgotten it and I just said it. Sadrawa. Because I always said Studrawa. Sadrawa would very regularly take 3-star talent and turn them into NFL draft picks. Obviously, the most noteworthy example was DeJuan Jones. We haven't seen that same ability to get the most out of lesser talent from Fry that we did from, I'm just going to call him Greg. It's too difficult for me to remember the last name at this point. Well, if you're listening, you know who I'm talking about. Anyway,
to your point though, like it's okay. So either you're developing 3-star talent to NFL draft picks, or you're finding 5-star talent and they're playing like 5 stars, and that hasn't necessarily happened either, right?
No, and we've made the point multiple times on the show in the off season that the recurring theme from the losses to Michigan the last 3 years has been getting beaten in the trenches, predominantly Ohio State's offensive line versus Michigan's defensive line. That is the biggest change that needs to take place if this team wants to right that wrong from the last 3 seasons. And I got to say, even though Donovan Jackson is apparently a preseason All-American, and even though I had a very high opinion of Justin Fry from last season, I remain unconvinced that this group is – we'll see how the season plays out, but it would be wrong for me to at the outset of the season say that I'm completely confident that this group is going to turn in its strongest performance relative to what has happened the last 3 years. I don't want to go as far as to say that I'm concerned, but that is where we need to see the most improvement out of anywhere else on the team if this team wants to live up to the lofty expectations that have been thrust upon it. And I think if this team does not, which we will get into in later questions in this session on the Dubcast today, I think it's going to be there. That's going to be the first place that people point and like thrust their frustrations onto, is the underperformance of the offensive line having been a recurring theme underneath Justin Fry, regardless of when the first loss for this team, if they do suffer one this season, comes about. I think that's going to be where people point to first. So a lot left to be proven from that group, I think.
All right, well, let's then that'll be a good segue into my first question, which is, looking at the games on the schedule, I think the biggest one that looms large for Ohio State, at least in terms of, win probability. I think there was something actually that was just posted for us that was like, this is a team that you got to really look out for. It was
ESPN's playoff predictor.
Yeah, right. Okay, there you go.
Among the 3 biggest games for Ohio State this year, they've got Ohio State narrowly beating Penn State. They've got Ohio State like nearly 75% confidence they'll beat Michigan, but they've got just barely over a third of a chance to beat Oregon, according to the
And so then that's my question. Does Ohio State roll into Eugene and come out with a win?
It's tough for me to say. I mean, I'm going to be working that game, so I would certainly like to see them win. But it's going to be. I've been dreading that game since the end of last season, much more so than the Michigan game, and I think that much of like the recent results against Michigan have had the common Ohio State fan more squarely focused on that than giving the attention to Oregon that it rightly deserved. And now I think that the common fan has seen the AP poll come out and seen Oregon right on the heels of Ohio State and is probably thinking, oh, maybe that's going to be more of a challenge than we thought.
Maybe we should actually pay attention to this team.
Now, the good news is, as many people may be thinking that they're going to lose to Oregon that are not Ohio State fans or just general media members, most of the general media has them rematching Oregon, if not in the Big Ten championship, that at some point in the college football playoff, if not in both cases. So a loss to Oregon isn't necessarily damning.
No, not in Eugene and not against that team.
In a way that it would have been damning in previous seasons for playoff selection, it is not going to be the same disqualifier at that point in the season that it perhaps could have been in previous seasons, particularly given the fact that they're ranked as high as they are, regardless of whether it ends up being a blowout or a very close game. Oregon's one of the toughest places to play. And the last time they played Oregon, they lost. And they're playing a coach that I believe Dan Lanning was at Georgia when they beat Ohio State.
I think he might have been, actually.
I think that was one of the last games that he coached at Georgia. So he has experience. Granted, that offense put up over 40 points on Georgia's defense at that game. But that is still someone that has experience against, like, structuring a defense against Ryan Day's system. So I think that I can understand why Oregon is being predicted to win that game. I would be surprised if Ohio State ends up being favored to win that game. I don't know if there's already a betting line or not, but I'm going to say at this point, just based on the question marks that Ohio State has at critical offensive positions, whether it be the line or even though Will Howard has now been named QB1, and that makes us feel very good given what we were saying relative to how the quarterback battle went last season. I don't know if 4 games against the level of competition that Ohio State is going to be playing in the early part of the season is going to provide enough of a tune-up for them to be ready for the Oregon game. My opinion could change in the week up to the Oregon game. You don't think
Marshall can get them ready?
They might be firing on all cylinders possible going into the second week of October, and I could feel very, very differently about it then than I do right now. But if you're asking me to speculate on, do I think this team is going to be ready to go to one of, if not the toughest place in the country to win on the road, after they've recently lost to that team at home within the last 5 years and against a coach that has experience beating them and coaching against them, I'm going to say I don't think they get it done. And maybe the homer in me in previous seasons would have more wanted to not recognize that, just given to what the long-term ramifications of that would be. I probably feel a little bit more comfortable knowing that it's not necessarily a disqualifying loss for their postseason hopes, that I feel good about them saying right now, I don't expect them to win that game. I don't think other fans of the Ohio State are going to be as measured in their expectations of that, and the fallout from that game, if they do lose, will be bad. But I would hope that more people take a measured approach, at least in terms of tempering expectations relative to what I'm saying. But I'm curious to hear what you think.
No. I mean, I do agree with that. I think there are a lot of people, a lot of fans who look at Oregon still with this idea that they're this, what's the term, like nouveau riche, like kind of, program. They're just playing with
that. They're still coached by Chip Kelly, which I have news for you.
Yeah, right.
That guy has moved on. He's on the other side now.
Yeah, but no, like it's like, oh yeah, Mike Belotti's team, and it's like, they're not that team anymore. They're very good. They brought in Dylan Gabriel out of Oklahoma, who is an excellent quarterback. Dan Lanning's a great coach. they're going to be playing at home. That's not a game I think they're going to win. And and again, a lot can change between now and then, right? This is the middle of August. It's taking place in early October. So don't get it twisted. Like there's a lot of football to be played between now and then. But if we're looking at the first marquee matchup that Ohio State's going to be playing, I don't know, man. I think that's a tough game for them to win, sitting where they are now, even with all the talent that they have. I think a lot of people just automatically dismiss a lot of what Oregon has kind of accomplished in building their program up in the past 2 or 3 years, and people will push to the back of their minds that loss against Oregon at home because they're like, oh, well, the defense was terrible and they would have won, blah, blah, blah. And then they go back to the national championship game where Ohio State just bullied the crap out of their lines for, the entire game. It's like, that's not Oregon anymore, man. Like they have legit talent on both sides of the line. They are not undersized. They're fast. They're tough. They're every bit a great, football team I think that Ohio State can be this season. They do have their deficiencies.
And they love killing programs with way too much hype behind them, which is exactly what they did to Colorado last season. Right. So they'll gear up for an opportunity like
they
that. They
absolutely will. And at home, like in their inaugural Big Ten season, I mean, that's tough. So I'm kind of with you, man. I don't think that that's going to be an easy one for Ohio State to pull out. Right now where I stand, I would put that down as an L, but it isn't going to be the end of Ohio State's postseason aspirations. And we'll kind of get into that in a little bit.
And again, that opinion is subject to change based on what we see in these openings. So they're going to play, they're going to have a much longer runway to that game with more certainty at quarterback than they did last year going into the Notre Dame game.
Absolutely. So absolutely.
But that said, I still.
But Oregon's also going to be way better than Notre Dame.
Right, yeah. But just relative to saying, like, what is the biggest test for this team in the early season in terms of drawing that comparison between last season and this season, there's more reason to feel confident that they'll figure it out, that you can feel good about them winning that than I think there was last year where I felt great in the preseason, and then as we got closer and closer and still didn't have certainty at quarterback, I was like, I really hope that they don't lose to this team I don't like at all.
Right. Maybe, God, if only Notre Dame can put 10 players on the field for 2 consecutive plays, that would just be ideal.
Oh my God, we forget about that so much.
Isn't that funny? And that's actually really the funniest part about Ryan Day's rant after that whole game about like, we're tough, we're here. I'm like, yeah, you did it against 10 guys. Come on, like it's cool. Like you won the game. I'm happy about that. But like, let's maybe put the brakes.
And it was wishful thinking that we thought, oh, Kyle McCord is clutch because of that.
That's right. Yeah. Anyway, so what's question number 2 for you, George?
I want to find the right way to phrase this. So I think that it's certainly an interesting situation at running back for Ohio State with Judkins coming in. In some ways, it reminds me of the situation that they had during the COVID season when Trey Sermon, in the first year that the portal became in the first year players had that immediate transfer eligibility in place. Mm-hmm. Trey Sermon came over from Oklahoma after being one of the most successful running backs they've ever had. And
saying something. I mean, he really was great at Oklahoma.
When Master Teague was poised to be the successor to J.K. Dobbins and created a bit, it seemed like there was going to be a bit of a timeshare situation, but then they, as the kind of weirdness of COVID happened, they really leaned on Teague more in the opening parts of their schedule. And I think Sermon was hurt for a lot too of the first part of that year.
Yeah.
And then finally they started getting to the postseason games. And obviously once they got to the Big Ten championship, that's when Sermon just went totally nuts against Northwestern and against Clemson and was poised to have a big game against Alabama, but then broke his collarbone on the first play of the game. So I only bring that up just because it feels like in terms of the coming into this season, there's still the perception of the 1A, 1B situation that was back then. I just think it's interesting that given Henderson's injury history, you would think that they're probably going to want to offload some of like him just being the workhorse and create a really like certain split between him and Judkins.
Right.
But if we get to a point where it's apparent that one guy is more effective than the other, do you think that they should, and it's especially interesting given how many carries and how much work that Judkins had at Ole Miss, which I'm sure that you'll talk about in your answer to this question.
Mm-hmm.
What, like, do if one of them ends up clearly being more effective than the other with the work that they're given, do
Right.
you think that Ohio State should lean on that running back as we get further into the season, or for the sake of keeping the workload light on both guys, do you think that they should stay in a timeshare regardless of the offense perhaps being bogged down by willingly giving carries to a visibly less effective running back?
Right. I think part of it's situational, in terms of like where the schedule is at, right? Like if you're at that point after game 5, right, you've beaten Iowa, whatever, you're going to Oregon, and you've got one guy who's just he's pulling off 125, 150 yards a game, right? And the other dude's maybe contributing but not doing so much. At that Oregon game, you ride or die with that one guy, right? Whoever's giving you, 100 yards plus, 5-6 yards a carry, that's the guy you got to go with in a situation like that. Like, I don't think you can think about too much about splitting carries or whatever. Now, with that said, if they're both being effective, if they're both doing what they need to do, then yeah, I think that's the smart move, particularly if you're going to want to try to, go deep in a playoff run. You want to make sure that you win the Big Ten championship. Like, you want to make sure you have those guys healthy. But when it comes to those big games, when it comes to those games where like you need to know that the guy that you're relying on is going to have a big game, going to get you the yards that you need, I don't think that you can stick to that philosophy too much. So Judkins has, I mean, like I think it's like 575 carries at this point in his career, almost 600, something like that. Ole Miss really like leaned on that guy hard for their offense in the past couple seasons, which makes understandable because of his talent. But I think both him and Travion Henderson are looking forward to having a guy spell them a little bit, where there's not going to be a significant drop off and you're just waiting for the guy to get back into the game. You know what I mean? And that's not to take anything away from some of the guys who have been in as Henderson's backups or in lieu of Henderson over the past few years. I mean, they've been talented, and then occasionally they've had some really great games, but none of them have been an RB number 1 type. And that's the difference. So if you have that, and you are playing a Marshall or a Western Michigan or even an Iowa or whatever, and you feel confident that both of those guys are going to, perform well and, produce well for you, then yeah, go for it. Split those carries, get them 12 each and call it a day. But if you're in a situation against an Oregon on the road or Penn State or Michigan or whatever, and one guy has clearly separated them, give them 30 carries. I don't care. Like, win the game, right? Because you can't be so wedded to that philosophy, even if that's why you brought those guys in. The goal here is to win football games, not to, meet some certain metric that you're trying to accomplish. I think.
Yeah. No, I can understand that. I just think that it becomes more of an interesting discussion if Judkins is the more effective performer than Henderson proves to be.
Right.
I think even if Henderson is clearly outperforming Judkins, that Judkins still needs to have some sort of a timeshare role just for the sake of not overusing Henderson, but just given his injury history. If Judkins proves to be the more effective performer than Henderson, then I think there's a different conversation that needs to take place relative to how can we use Henderson more effectively in the offense if it's very apparent that we just need to be giving it to Judkins because he's falling forward for 4 or 5 yards every time he touches the football. And that kind of consistency, particularly next to a running style quarterback like Will Howard, is just very, very effective for keeping the defense honest.
Mm-hmm.
If the home run threat for Henderson just isn't there, then how else can he be used in this offense?
Right.
Or is it real, or, just given the fact that you would think one of the reasons that Judkins came over here was because he wasn't going to be getting leaned on for 35 carries in a given game the way that he was at Ole Miss. Like, what if it ends up being the best course of action to give that guy the ball 30 times a game?
Yeah, right.
So I think it's a more interesting discussion.
Hey, Quinchon, I'm just telling you, man, we're going to keep you healthy. We're going to keep you happy, sane. Listen, go out there and just run your head into the wall.
We've seen that spin move in EA Sports College Football 25.
You said it was close to real life.
And we want to see it 30 times a game.
That's
so
right.
It's a more interesting discussion if he outperforms Henderson. But
I think you're right. Yeah.
I think regardless of how well Henderson does, they've got to have some sort of spell for him because he can't be handling that workload, or he's not going to be available down the stretch of the season.
Correct. Yeah.
Which has unfortunately been the case in recent years more often than not.
Yeah. All right. So my question here then is, so let's Ohio State get past Oregon, Eugene. They've really got, I think according to what most people would say is a 3-game schedule. You've got Penn State, you got Michigan, you got Oregon, and then you kind of coast for the rest. But is there a trap game here? Is there anyone that they, might come up and snake bite them? What do you see on there? Is there anything spooky on that schedule?
If we're
you get Purdue at home,
ignoring those 3,
yeah,
Purdue at home doesn't scare me,
right? Because it's at home. It's
West Lafayette, terrifying.
Yes,
Iowa at home doesn't scare me,
right?
In Iowa City, terrifying. There's hexes in those 2 scenarios, but getting them at home eases a lot of the tension. That Northwestern game at Wrigley Field just gives me so many bad vibes.
It could be. It could be environmentally. It might be one of the worst games Ohio State has played in a long time, since the last Northwestern game.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So. Exactly. We talked about it when we were talking about the Wrigley Field ticket prices getting announced. It's the elements made that the least palatable half of football that I think we've seen. It was in quite some time from a Ryan Day offense. It was grotesque. I think Emeka Egbuka was the leading rusher for Ohio State that afternoon. Nothing about that game made sense.
Right.
But what really more than just speculating on what the mid-November weather in Chicago is going to be and how that affects both teams. Northwestern, after the Pat Fitzgerald saga relative to Shrek Gate last year, they were written off as a dead program because he was supposed to be their guy, their coach for life, and they lost their identity. Their greatest player in program history, not named Otto Graham. The guy that was the epitome of Northwestern football has been scandalously removed. They've been stripped of their identity and mired in scandal. They're gone. And then David Braun emerges out of nowhere and becomes he puts on one of the best coaching jobs in college football last year in terms of salvaging that program. And they finished with an 8-5 record last year.
Which I don't think anybody expected.
Nobody. Absolutely nobody could have guessed after losing Pat Fitzgerald a month before the start of the season that Northwestern was going to not only have a winning record, but win 8 games.
And a bowl game.
Last year.
Including a bowl game. Yeah.
That team is very well coached. And he is a defensive-minded head coach. If we see the struggles from Ohio State's offensive line that we were speculating on earlier in this podcast, if Ohio State is not clicking on all cylinders by that point, that game could be very gross. Yeah. And I hope people are just setting expectations for it and not paying for those Wrigley Field ticket prices because you might end up paying for something that you really hate watching that you could have just seen at home from the comfort of your television.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good choice, honestly. It is such a weird environment and situation, and they are going to be better, I think, than people think. I mean, they lost a lot. Their offense is going to be bad, but defensively they should be really solid. And again, you're in this goofy environment in the middle of November, and it's just, I don't know. That's bad mojo all over it. If I have to pick another one besides Northwestern, I'm not really concerned about Iowa, but I kind of am, just because I think they're better than people think. I know
because Cade McNamara has beaten Ohio State before.
Well, the thing is, they were a meme last season, and everybody made fun of them, and that's fair. That was all fair because they were trash. But they also had a really, really good defense, and relative to the amount of time that they had to spend,
they
on
weren't
the field,
trash. Their offense was trash.
Yes, their offense was trash.
Their special teams was the best in the country, and their defense was
how
very
many
elite.
games didn't they win? Like 10 games last year. And they did that by scoring like 14 points a game. So they had a defense that was probably, arguably, one of the best defenses in college football in the past decade. But they paired it with one of the worst offenses in college football in the past decade, and they still were like in it to win it, in the Big Ten like title race until the very end. So I I wanted them to beat Michigan in the Big Ten. I knew that wasn't going to happen, but I could see how it was possible. And while I don't think their offense is going to be really all that much better, if at all better, their defense is still pretty much the same, and they're going to be tough. That's going to be a tough out. I don't think Ohio State will struggle that much with them, because again, that offense is probably still going to be brutally bad. But weird stuff can happen, and that would be another one of those teams where I think they need to take seriously, particularly right before that Oregon game, and not look ahead, because you get them at home. It's a game you should win. Just don't do anything stupid, and don't turn the ball over, and you'll get out of there just fine. But like I said, stranger things have happened.
I think they tend to overperform at home and then underperform on the road, which is why I'm not as concerned with them coming to Columbus.
And I think that's a fair observation. I think that's, if it were in Iowa, I would probably be crazy.
I would be terrified, especially fifth game of the season, the week before Oregon. I would be horrified if it were in Iowa.
Yeah, 100%.
But it's not.
It's not. All right, what's your last question here?
As we alluded to earlier in the show, and we've been talking about for most of the season, Johnny and I wanted more certainty at quarterback than we got last year. One of the big storylines within the last week since our last episode is that we got the starter named, and it's Will Howard, as we thought he had sewn up the job, and those, the reporting was accurate. So
yes,
we're grateful for that. What I'm wondering is, if Will Howard, heaven forbid, suffers some kind of injury or is otherwise rendered unable to continue at some point in the season, we'll say it's the middle of the season.
Okay.
Let's say after the Oregon game.
Okay.
So Oregon's already come and gone, so you're not worried about.
And we assume they've won all those games to that point.
Sure. Regardless of what the result in the Oregon game is.
Okay.
Howard is no longer available. Who do you want them to go to for plan B? Yeah. Especially because my big concern with Devin Brown is
he turns the ball over and gets injured constantly.
Well, no, just that he gets injured.
I mean,
you run the risk of, and I mean, we would all love to relive the 2014 season where you lose two quarterbacks and your third guy still ends up being someone that can guide you to the national championship. But that's not really a realistic expectation for most college football programs. So if you lose your plan A in the middle of the season, heaven forbid, who do you feel more comfortable with them turning to? Devin Brown or Julian Sayin, or perhaps even Aaron Noland?
Wow. Lincoln Keenhole slander.
You're not that guy, pal.
No,
you're not that guy.
God, that's a really great question. I actually think that's one of the best questions we have on this, because my gut says Julian Sayin. If I'm giving my first response,
I'm throwing Sayin into the fire.
Honestly, honest to God, because I don't think Brown gets you there. I really don't. I don't think that Devin Brown's going to get you to the promised land. If you want to beat Michigan, win the Big Ten championship, win the national championship, all that stuff, I don't think he has I don't think his ceiling is high enough. The thing, you bring up like Cardale Jones.
I think he's the safer option. I just don't trust him to stay healthy.
I don't trust him at all.
And if this team loses two quarterbacks to injury, it's like I mean, that just totally deflates your morale.
Well, and really the assumption of this question is that your backup quarterback is the guy that you are coaching and practicing as your backup, right? Like this is the guy who's been taking reps, who has been preparing to step in if needed from day one, right? I feel more comfortable with a guy like Julian Sayin, who's been doing that since, day one, start of camp, blah, blah, whatever, as the presumptive number 2 than I would with Devin Brown. And honestly, like you brought up Cardale Jones, nobody knew who the hell he was. Okay. Cause he was 3rd on the depth chart for a reason, but he also has insane arm talent. I mean, that was the guy who could throw it 70 yards on a frozen rope. And that's how they beat Wisconsin, right? They did it by just throwing bombs over the tops of their heads and just having Devin Brown like catch 1 billion touchdowns. I don't see something like that with Devin Brown, right? If he were like Johnny Manziel back there and like, making crazy, moves and making guys miss or whatever.
Sense.
Yeah, right. You'd be like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. Maybe he's not a guy we want as the starter because he's just too loosey-goosey with the ball or whatever, but you can see the talent. I don't see that next level talent out of Brown to the point where I'd be like, okay, this is the guy I want as the backup. So I would say Sayin, because of everything that people have been saying about his arm, his ability to command the offense, he has that extra level of talent that I think you have to have in a backup where, if you're missing some kind of consistency from your starter, you got to have somebody who brings an X factor to the game. And I think of the guys available, he's the dude with that. I think a guy like Aaron Nolan in the next few years could develop into an amazing quarterback. But again, I don't know that right now his talent level is such where he would be the guy you would put in as a spark plug to help your team out if you lose your starting guy. So that's where I'm at.
I should amend my answer a little bit because I've marinated on it a little bit more. The hype beast in me just wants to say Sayin, but here's what I'll say. If this team is clicking on all cylinders and then Howard gets hurt,
okay,
I think at that point it's probably better to go to Devin Brown just because he probably replicates Howard's skill set a little bit better than Sayin does relative to being a running threat. If it wasn't really going like as well as it feels like it could have been with Howard and then Howard gets hurt, I think at that point it's fair to say, do we go to Sayin because he presumably has the higher ceiling than Brown does? So I think it's going to depend on the context of how well the team is doing in the event that Howard gets hurt for them to choose between the two of them. In a purely general context, I would say Sayin just because I have less built-in injury concerns than I do with Devin Brown.
Right. Well, and then we can trade those for like height concerns or something like that. All right. Last question here. This one is for me, and this is kind of, the whole kit and caboodle, which is, what's the minimum result that would constitute a successful season for Ohio State this year? Like, what do we have to see for us to go, yes, that was a successful
beat Michigan season? I don't care about anything else.
So you don't care about...
I don't need to see this team win a title. I don't need to see them even win a Big Ten championship. Just beat Michigan, right the greatest wrong, fill the void that has been in my life for the last 3 years, and I will be more than satisfied. I say this every year, and some people think I'm insane, but I don't care. This team could go 1-11. And if the one win is over Michigan, it is a successful season. Because think about how funny it would be for an 0-11 Ohio State team to beat Michigan.
Oh, that would be hilarious.
Exactly. So in that scenario,
I hope that's not what we have to hang our hat on.
I hope so too, because it's going to be a rough season on the Dubcast and around 11 Warriors.
That would be a long couple months.
Beat Michigan. I don't care about anything else. I honestly could not care. You beat that team. You right the wrong. Yeah. It is a success for me.
I think that's definitely priority one. If you told me that, okay, you have to choose between the three: win a Big Ten championship, win a national championship, beat Michigan. I mean, honestly, at this point, I don't know. Well, I'd say national championship. I actually would still go with that, but it's close. That would be a tough decision for me between winning a national championship and beating Michigan at this point.
For the minimum constitution of a successful season?
Well, just if you gave me the options between the three, the minimum Constitution, you beat Michigan. That's a successful season.
Dude, you like if you lose to Michigan and win a national title, yeah, I'm going to take that too.
Right.
But I'm saying for the bare minimum standard, I will be satisfied if they right the greatest wrong they've had the last 3 years.
That's fair.
I don't need to see it happen if they win a national title,
right?
But
that's the minimum. That's the floor.
Yes, that for me as a fan, that's
fair. No, I think they have to beat Michigan, and I think they have to at least win one game in the college football playoff. I need to see both of those things happen. I don't really care that much about the Big Ten championship because there's so many different factors that go into that. Plus, you're coming off like an emotional game against Michigan. There's all kinds of stuff that you're going to have to deal with that. I think they've got to beat Michigan. I think they have to win one game in the playoff, at least. I want to see them play for a title. I think they have the talent to do that, but I just feel like there's so many variables from between now and then for me to really like get super invested in whatever happens in the playoff. I mean, whatever the teams look like at that point after a billion games, who knows? But Michigan really is that's priority one, and everything after that, again, barring a complete collapse, will be gravy. So I'm with you. I think the beating Michigan is a big deal, and I'm pretty confident that they're going to get it done this season. But
I would like to see it.
I would like to see it. All right, those are our questions. Thank you for sticking with us as we went through them. We want to remind you that the Dubcast is sponsored by the dry goods store at 11warriors.com, drygoods.11warriors.com. Sure, Tet stickers, check it out. They're great. Let's blaze through Ask Us Anything, and then we've got. Tell you what, we'll do a couple Ask Us Anythings this week, and then we will. We're going to move on to a few Ohio State things before we get out of here. But I appreciate you guys asking this. We'll keep the other ones in our pocket for next time. Let's go ahead and answer this question from a good friend Alvin, who wants to know: flag football has been announced for the 2028 Olympics. Ooh la la! If you had a Buckeye squad, Buckeyes currently at Ohio State or an alum, who would you put on your flag football team to represent the United States?
Wow. I wasn't expecting this question.
That's the nature of Ask Us Anything. That's why we do it.
Yeah, but I mean, I can't. I'm not going to give you all 22.
How about that? Well, no, you don't. No. It's flag football, so it's fewer guys. But let's just pick one each. Who is like the ideal guy that you think would be like flag football king? That would be an Ohio State representative and in their prime. So you can pick anybody. It doesn't have to be like,
it doesn't have to be an active player.
No, let's expand it. Cause
I was going to say like, you put Stroud on there. You put Stroud and Olave on the same team. And I think those guys absolutely crush.
Oh, they beat everybody in the world.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Right. But
especially after how stunned we were with Olave's 40-yard dash performance at the combine.
Right. Yeah. It's like, wait a minute.
Like that guy in a flag football setting with Stroud throwing him the ball. Come on,
that would rule. I'd say.
I think. Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah. All right. If we're going all time, then yeah, that's my favorite Buckeye ever. Like,
yeah, I'm going Ted Yen. You just send him out an hour out. Forget about it. I mean, game over.
Well, you still got to make sure someone's throwing him the ball. Honestly, I just take that. It feels like that recent Ohio State offense with Stroud and Wilson and Olave that
seems like kind of made for flag football in a way.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Just stick that in there and run with it.
I get it. I think that's I think that's a pretty good answer there. All right. Tell you what, we'll do this one. Let's see. This is from.
I want Ryan Shazier on defense though. I absolutely need that.
Antoine Winfield, I think would be a good choice. That guy just like running all over the place. I think would be a pretty good, maybe, I don't know. I'm trying to think of another guy who would be like a really good, like just rangy guy to play defense. You need like a DB, right? I don't know. I mean, like Von Bell might be a good guy. It's interesting. Okay. So we kind of talked about the offensive line a bit. This is from Kevin. This is actually kind of an expansion of something we talked about with the running backs. Let's say, okay, so the question is, who do you expect will be the breakdown in carries for the running backs? We talked about like what the ideal situation was and what it looks like, but who do you think will get the most carries out of the running backs this season?
It's tough to say at the outset because we're presumably going to get a bit of a thunder and lightning combination with Judkins being the more hard hitting runner and Henderson being more of the home run threat.
Right.
I think it just depends on which guy ends up being more effective. But if you had I think based on what their styles are, I would expect. I would expect Judkins to get a little bit more volume of touches than Henderson, just because he's handled more workloads. Like I think realistically, think about how many games you've seen Henderson handle 20 or more carries at Ohio State.
Right.
I mean, the list can't be very high. I can't imagine there've been more than 5.
Yeah.
Like he's a guy that is just remarkably efficient with the touches that he gets when he's healthy.
Well, and here's the other thing. I think he'll be used more in the passing game too than people might expect.
Well, we were saying that last year too, and it didn't really come to fruition the way that we were hoping.
They should do it because he's really freaking good. But
they should. But that goes to my point that I made earlier in the show, and that if Judkins is the guy overperforming, how else do you figure out how to get Henderson involved?
Right.
And on paper, you would say it's easily just use him in the passing game, but they haven't done that nearly as often as they perhaps should have in previous seasons. He should have been a check down option on every Kyle McCord drop back last year. And that just didn't happen, period.
Yeah. Interesting thing about Trayvon Henderson. So to your point, all right. So, and he's been at Ohio State for 31 games. Okay. He's had 20 or more carries. He only did it twice last season. He's had 20 or more carries 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times in 31 games.
That's what I said.
Yeah.
I don't think it's happened more than 5 times.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you something else too. One of the winning prop bets that I put out for Easy Bucks last year was the Michigan State game, where I think the line on his catches was over 3.5 receptions. And I told people to bet the under, and I think he finished with 2, maybe.
He did,
or
no,
it was receiving yards. I think it was receiving yards. The line was 35, and I didn't think he was going to get more than that. So he only had 2 catches for 14 yards that game, as you said. So he just is not. And that was a game where they win 37-0 or something. They could have presumably open the playbook up as much as they wanted to try to, develop. And again, we talk about, them not wanting to put stuff on film for Michigan and whatever. So maybe some of that came into play too, but it's not like we saw them really use him as a receiving threat in the Michigan game.
Yeah.
The option has been there for the kind of player that he is, and we just haven't really seen it. So
and
I would like to see him more dynamically involved, but I'm not convinced it's going to happen. We know the kind of profile that Judkins composes. I think based on his experience handling that kind of workload, he's probably going to end up getting more touches just because of that, so that Henderson can, after Judkins has roughed the defense up a little bit, continue to be as efficient with the touches that he gets as possible and really hit home runs on his carries.
Yeah, 100%. So that's Ask Us Anything for this week. Still have a couple in our pocket. Don't worry if we didn't get to your question this week. We'll definitely get it to it next week. Dubcast at 11warriors.com. Keep asking those questions. We'll keep answering them. A few things we want to get into before we get out of here. First of all, we've been talking a lot about football. We did not mention that Ohio State, or have not yet mentioned that Ohio State named their captains for the 24 season. I'm pretty excited about that. I think it kind of tells a little bit about where the team's at, but the fact that you've got, a lot of senior leadership, obviously, I think says kind of where the team is at. And Emeka Buka is obviously, I don't think anybody's surprised that he was one of the captains. Trayvon Henderson, Jack Sawyer, Cody Simon, pretty much, I think, no surprises at all.
It's a pretty
really
straightforward list.
Yeah, if you had asked somebody to pull names out of a hat and just said, okay, these are, you would put all the seniors in, and I think those are the guys people would have expected to come out. That's not a surprise, I think, to anyone. Maybe JT, I don't know, but in general, those are guys who've been there for a long time. They have a lot of respect within the program. They're the guys that people go to for, analysis and quotes. Little surprise, maybe you didn't see some other defensive guys kind of in the mix, but still, that's pretty.
I think
legit.
the most surprising omission for me, just because of how much has been put on this being one of the selling points for him being the starter, is Will Howard. But I also understand that that's a guy that's only been with the program for 6 months and hasn't actually played it down yet.
I kind of expected Burke to be in on it, but given that he seems to be the go-to guy, for somebody wants an opinion on how the team's going or feedback on a new guy or something like that, he seems to be kind of this I don't know, this imperial figure. People are like, oh, well, let's get an honest opinion from Denzel. But he cast judgment on Will Howard at the dawn of spring practice, and they said that is disqualifying. He found him wanting
your captainship. How dare you?
Cody Simon gets the Blocko jersey, which is awesome. Which is, of course, it's a big deal. It's not something they just hand out. It's somebody who's earned it. It's about leadership. It's in memory of Bill Willis, who, was just, this tough guy, and his number's been retired. So that's kind of emblematic of his stuff. And speaking of, tough guys and people who are remembered, Archie Griffin's finally going to get a statue out of Ohio State. And this comes after his statue was unveiled at the Rose Bowl, which weird, a little weird. I mean, I like that he's got a statue. I mean, I love Archie. He's a fantastic human being and obviously one of the greatest college football players of all time. But, it's not Ohio State Stadium. And I think I
love it. It's going to make for a very funny footnote when Ohio State finally travels to UCLA for the Big Ten road game.
Yeah, I don't know what his record. I think it was like 1-3 or something in the Rose Bowl. I don't know. I don't think Ohio State as a team did super hot in his Rose Bowl appearances, but he did great. I mean, he had.
Well, didn't they not win a national championship because of UCLA too?
Yeah.
While he was there.
Yes, correct.
So that's just a whole mess.
It's really weird, but it's a great statue. He's got his cool 70s fro going on. He looks like a badass, doing the Heisman pose. Like
he's got the lamb chops too on his facial hair.
Yeah, he looks great. I think that a statue of him at Ohio Stadium is overdue. So I'm excited that they're gonna get that rolling here in Columbus because that's definitely something that needs to be added to the stadium. I'm excited about that.
For a long time I've wanted them to put like statues up on the columns on
that would be really cool.
I know you said I know last week you said you wanted to put Guy Fieri's hair up there if they make it Flavortown Stadium.
Yeah.
I want
like an old Roman Forum thing where they've got like giant statues.
Yeah, because they already have security guards standing at the top of those things anyway. Instead, you do it like the Vatican, where you've got the statues of the players up there like that.
That would be sick. That would be so cool.
That's always what I've wanted to see.
That would be so cool. That would really lean into the whole like ancient Rome, Greece aesthetic. That would be awesome. I would love that. That's a great idea. On top of like pillars or on top of the surround. Yeah, that would be sick. Even if you couldn't really make it, it's like, I don't know. That would be cool.
They've already got snipers on top of Lincoln and Merrill Tower or whatever. So do we really need two more at the south end of the stadium? Like, come on.
No, let's put some statues on there.